glared maniacally at Captain Blood. A man may not fear to die, and yet be appalled by the form in which death comes to him. From frothing lips he hurled blasphemies and insults at his tormentor. Foul barbarian, inhuman savage, accursed heretic, will it not content you to kill me in some Christian fashion? Captain Blood vouchsafed him a malignant smile before he turned to meet the 15 manacled Spanish prisoners who were thrust into his presence. Approaching, they had heard Don Diego's outcries. At close quarters now they beheld with horror-stricken eyes his plight. From amongst them a comely, olive-skinned stripling, distinguished in bearing and apparel from his companions, started forward with an anguished cry of "Father!" Writhing in the arms that made haste to seize and hold him, he called upon heaven and hell to avert this horror, and lastly, addressed to Captain Blood an appeal for mercy that was at once fierce and piteous. Considering him, Captain Blood thought with satisfaction that he displayed the proper degree of filial piety. He afterwards confessed that for a moment he was in danger of weakening, that for a moment his mind rebelled against the pitiless thing it had planned. But to correct the sentiment, he evoked a memory of what these Spaniards had performed in Bridgetown. Again he saw the white face of that child Mary Trail as she fled in horror before the jeering ruffian whom he had slain, and other things even more unspeakable seen on that dreadful evening rose now before the eyes of his memory to stiffen his faltering purpose. The Spaniards had shown themselves without mercy or sentiment or decency of any kind. Stuffed with religion, they were without a spark of that Christianity, the symbol of which was mounted on the mainmast of the approaching ship. A moment ago this cruel, vicious Don Diego had insulted the Almighty by his assumption that he kept a specially benevolent watch over the destinies of Catholic Spain. Don Diego should be taught his error, recovering the cynicism in which he had approached his task, the cynicism essential to its proper performance. He commanded Ogle to kindle a match and remove the leaden apron from the touch-hole of the gun that bore Don Diego. Then, as the younger Espinosa broke into fresh intercessions mingled with imprecations, he wheeled upon him sharply. "Peace," he snapped. "Peace, and listen. It is no part of my intention to blow your father to hell as he deserves, or indeed to take his life at all." Having surprised the lad into silence by that promise, a promise surprising enough in all the circumstances, he proceeded to explain his aims in that faultless and elegant Castilian, of which he was fortunately master, as fortunately for Don Diego as for himself. "It is your father's treachery that has brought us into this plight, and deliberately into risk of capture and death aboard that ship of Spain. Just as your father recognized his brother's flagship, so will his brother have recognized the Cinco Lagos. So far, then all is well. But presently the Encarnacion will be sufficiently close to perceive that here all is not as it should be. Sooner or later, she must guess or discover what is wrong, and then she will open fire or lay us board and board. Now, we are in no case to fight, as your father knew when he ran us into this trap. But fight we will, if we are driven to it. We make no tame surrender to the ferocity of Spain." He laid his hand on the breech of the gun that bore Don Diego. "Understand this clearly. To the first shot from the Encarnacion, this gun will fire the answer. I make myself clear, I hope?" White-faced and trembling, young Espinosa stared into the pitiless blue eyes that so steadily regarded him. "If it is clear," he faltered, breaking the utter silence in which all were standing. "But, name of God, how should it be clear? How should I understand? Can you avert the fight? If you know a way, and if I or these can help you to it, if that is what you mean, in heaven's name let me hear it." A fight would be averted if Don Diego de Espinosa were go aboard his brother's ship, and by his presence and assurances inform the admiral that all is well with the Cinco Lagos, that she is indeed still a ship of Spain as her flag now announces. But of course Don Diego cannot go in person because he is otherwise engaged. He has a slight touch of fever, shall we say, that detains him in his cabin. But you, his son, may convey all this and some other matters together with his homage to your uncle. You shall go in a boat manned by 6 of these Spanish prisoners, and I, a distinguished Spaniard delivered from captivity in Barbados by your recent raid, will accompany you to keep you in countenance. If I return alive and without accident of any kind to hinder our free sailing hence, Don Diego shall have his life, as shall every one of you. But if there is the least misadventure, be it from treachery or ill fortune, I care not which the battle, as I have had the honor to explain, will be open on our side by this gun, and your father will be the first victim of the conflict." He paused a moment. There was a hum of approval from his comrades, an anxious stirring among the Spanish prisoners. Young Espinosa stood before him, the color ebbing and flowing in his cheeks. He waited for some direction from his father, but none came. Don Diego's courage, it seemed, had sadly waned under that rude test. He hung limply in his fearful bonds and was silent. Evidently, he dared not encourage his son to defiance, and presumably was ashamed to urge him to yield. Thus, he left decision entirely with the youth. "Come," said Blood. "I have been clear enough, I think. What do you say?" Don Esteban moistened his parched lips, and with the back of his hand mopped the anguished sweat from his brow. His eyes gazed wildly a moment upon the shoulders of his father, as if beseeching guidance. But his father remained silent. Something like a sob escaped the boy. I accept," he answered at last, and swung to the Spaniards. "And you will accept too," he insisted passionately. "For Don Diego's sake and for your own, for all our sakes. If you do not, this man will butcher us all without mercy." Since he yielded, and their leader himself counseled no resistance, why should they encompass their own destruction by a gesture of futile heroism? They answered without much hesitation that they would do as was required of them. Blood turned and advanced to Don Diego. "I am sorry to inconvenience you in this fashion, but—" For a second he checked and frowned as his eyes intently observed the prisoner. Then, after that scarcely perceptible pause, he continued, "But I do not think that you have anything beyond this inconvenience to apprehend, and you may depend upon me to shorten it as far as possible." Don Diego made him no answer. Peter Blood waited a moment, observing him. Then he bowed and stepped back. Chapter 12. Don Pedro Sangre. The Cinco Lagos and the Encarnacion, after a proper exchange of signals, lay hold within a quarter of a mile of each other, and across the intervening space of gently heaving. Sunlit water sped a boat from the former, manned by 6 Spanish seamen, and bearing in her stern sheets Don Esteban de Espinosa and Captain Peter Blood. She also bore 2 treasure chests containing 50,000 pieces of 8. Gold has at all times been considered the best of testimonies of good faith, and Blood was determined that in all respect appearances should be entirely on his side. His followers had accounted this a supererogation pretense, but Blood's will in the matter had prevailed. He carried further a bulky package addressed to a grande of Spain, heavily sealed with the arms of Espinosa, another piece of evidence hastily manufactured in the cabin of the Cinco Lagos, and he was spending these last moments in completing his instructions to his young companion. Don Esteban expressed his last lingering uneasiness. "But if you should betray yourself," he cried, "it will be unfortunate for everybody. I advise your father to say a prayer for our success. I depend upon you to help me more materially. I will do my best. God knows I will do my best." The boy protested. Blood nodded thoughtfully, and no more was said until they bumped alongside the towering mass of the Encarnadon. Up the ladder went Don Esteban, closely followed by Captain Blood. In the waist stood the Admiral himself to receive them, a handsome, self-sufficient man, very tall and stiff, a little older and grayer than Don Diego, whom he closely resembled. He was supported by 4 officers and a friar in the black and white habit of St. Dominic. Don Miguel opened his arms to his nephew, whose lingering panic he mistook for pleasurable excitement, and having enfolded him to his bosom, turned to greet Don Esteban's companion. Peter Blood bowed gracefully, entirely at his ease, so far as might be judged from appearances. "I am," he announced, making a literal translation of his name, "Don Pedro Sangre, an unfortunate gentleman of Leon, lately delivered from captivity by Don Esteban's most gallant father." And in a few words he sketched the imagined conditions of his capture by, and deliverance from, those accursed heretics who held the island of Barbados. "Benedicamus Domino," said the friar to his tale. "Ex hoc nunc ite usque in seculum," replied Blood, the occasional papist, with lowered eyes. The Admiral and his attending officers gave him a sympathetic hearing and a cordial welcome. Then came the dreaded question. "But where is my brother? Why has he not come himself to greet me?" It was young Espinosa who answered this. "My father is afflicted at denying himself that honor and pleasure. But unfortunately, Sir Uncle, he is a little indisposed. Oh, nothing grave. merely sufficient to make him keep his cabin. It is a little fever, the result of a slight wound taken in the recent raid upon Barbados, which resulted in this gentleman's happy deliverance. Nay, nephew, nay. Don Miguel protested with ironic repudiation. I can have no knowledge of these things. I have the honor to represent upon the seas His Catholic Majesty, who is at peace with the King of England. Already you have told me more than it is good for me to know. I will endeavor to forget it, and I will ask you, sirs, he added, glancing at his officers, to forget it also. But he winked into the twinkling eyes of Captain Blood, then added matter that at once extinguished that twinkle. But since Diego cannot come to me, why, I will go across to him. For a moment Don Esteban's face was a mask of pallid fear. Then Blood was speaking in a lowered, confidential voice that admirably blended suavity, impressiveness, and sly mockery. If you please, Don Miguel, but that is the very thing you must not do. The very thing Don Diego does not wish you to do. You must not see him until his wounds are healed. That is his own wish. That is the real reason why he is not here. For the truth is that his wounds are not so grave as to have prevented his coming. It was his consideration of himself and the false position in which you would be placed if you had direct word from him of what has happened. As your excellency has said, there is peace between His Catholic Majesty and the King of England and your brother Don Diego. He paused a moment. I am sure that I need say no more. What you hear from us is no more than a mere rumor. Your excellency understands. His excellency frowned thoughtfully. I understand, in part, said he. Captain Blood had a moment's uneasiness. Did the Spaniard doubt his bona fides? Yet in dress and speech he knew himself to be impeccably Spanish. And was not Don Esteban there to confirm him? He swept on to afford further confirmation before the Admiral could say another word. And we have in the boat below 2 chests containing 50,000 pieces of 8, which we are to deliver to your excellency. His excellency jumped. There was a sudden stir among his officers. They are the ransom extracted by Don Diego from the governor of... Not another word. In the name of heaven, cried the Admiral in alarm. My brother wishes me to assume charge of this money. To carry it to Spain for him? Well, that is a family matter between my brother and myself. So it can be done, but I must not know. He broke off. A glass of Malaga in my cabin, if you please. He invited them, whilst the chests are being hauled aboard. He gave his orders touching the embarkation of these chests, then led the way to his regally appointed cabin, his 4 officers and the friar following by particular invitation. Seated at table there, with the tawny wine before them, and the servant who had poured it withdrawn, Don Miguel laughed and stroked his pointed, grizzled beard. Virgin Santissima, that brother of mine has a mind that thinks of everything. Left to myself, I might have committed a fine indiscretion by venturing aboard his ship at such a moment. I might have seen things which, as Admiral of Spain, it would be difficult for me to ignore. Both Esteban and Blood made haste to agree with him. And then Blood raised his glass and drank to the glory of Spain and the damnation of the besotted James who occupied the throne of England. The latter part of his toast was at least sincere. The Admiral laughed. Sir, you need my brother here to curb your imprudences. You should remember that His Catholic Majesty and the King of England are very good friends. That is not a toast proposed in this cabin. But since it has been proposed, and by one who has such particular personal cause to hate these English hounds, why, we will honor it, but unofficially. They laughed and drank the damnation of King James, quite unofficially, but the more fervently on that account. Then Don Esteban, uneasy on the score of his father, and remembering that the agony of Don Diego was being protracted with every moment that they left him in his dreadful position, rose and announced that they must be returning. My father, he explained, is in haste to reach San Domingo. He desired me to stay no longer than necessary to embrace you. If you will give us leave, then, Sir Uncle, in the circumstances Sir Uncle did not insist. As they returned to the ship's side, Blood's eyes anxiously scanned a line of seamen leaning over the bulwarks in idle talk with the Spaniards in the cockboat that waited at the ladder's foot, but their manner showed him that there was no ground for his anxiety. The boat's crew had been wisely reticent. The Admiral took leave of them, of Esteban affectionately, of Blood ceremoniously. I regret to lose you so soon, Don Pedro. I wish that you could have made a longer visit to the Encarnacion. I am indeed unfortunate, said Captain Blood politely, but I hope that we may meet again. That is to flatter me beyond all that I deserve. They reached the boat, and she cast off from the great ship. As they were pulling away, the admiral waving to them from the taffrail, they heard the shrill whistle of the boatswain piping the hands to their stations, and before they had reached the Cinco Llagas, they beheld the Encarnacion go about under sail. She dipped her flag to them, and from her poop a gun fired a salute. Aboard the Cinco Llagas someone, it proved afterwards to be Hagthorpe, had the wit to reply in the same fashion. The comedy was ended. Yet there was something else to follow as an epilogue, a thing that added a grim ironic flavor to the whole. As they stepped into the waist of the Cinco Llagas, Hagthorpe advanced to receive them. Blood observed the set, almost scared expression on his face. "I see that you found it," he said quietly. Hagthorpe's eyes looked a question, but his mind dismissed whatever thought it held. "Don Diego," he was beginning, and then stopped and looked curiously at Blood. Noting the pause and the look, Esteban bounded forward, his face livid. "Have you broken faith, you curs? Has he come to harm?" he cried, and the sick Spaniard behind him grew clamorous with furious questionings. "We do not break faith," said Hagthorpe firmly, so firmly that he quieted them. "And in this case there was not the need. Don Diego died in his bonds before ever you reached the Encarnacion." Peter Blood said nothing. "Died!" screamed Esteban. "You killed him, you mean. Of what did he die?" Hagthorpe looked at the boy. "If I am a judge," he said, "Don Diego died of fear." Don Esteban struck Hagthorpe across the face at that, and Hagthorpe would have struck back, but that Blood got between, whilst his followers seized the lad. "Let be," said Blood. "You provoked the boy by your insult to his father." "I was not concerned to insult," said Hagthorpe, nursing his cheek. "It is what has happened. Come and look." "I have seen," said Blood. "He died before I left the Cinco Llagas. He was hanging dead in his bonds when I spoke to him before leaving." "What are you saying?" cried Esteban. Blood looked at him gravely. Yet for all his gravity, he seemed almost to smile, though without mirth. "If you had known that he asked at last. For a moment Don Esteban stared at him wide-eyed, incredulous. "I don't believe you," he said at last. "Yet you may. I am a doctor, and I know death when I see it." Again there came a pause, whilst conviction sank into the lad's mind. "If I had known that," he said at last in a thick voice, "you would be hanging from a yardarm of the Encarnacion at this moment." "I know," said Blood. "I am considering it, the profit that a man may find in the ignorance of others." "But you'll hang there yet," the boy raved. Captain Blood shrugged and turned on his heel, but he did not on that account disregard the words, nor did Hagthorpe, nor yet the others who overheard them, as they showed a council held that night in the cabin. This council was met to determine what should be done with the Spanish prisoners. Considering that Curacao now lay beyond their reach, as they were running short of water and provisions, and also that Pitt was hardly yet in case to undertake the navigation of the vessel, it had been decided that, going east of Hispaniola, and then sailing along its northern coast, they should make for Tortuga, that haven of the buccaneers, in which lawless port they had at least no danger of recapture to apprehend. It was now a question whether they should convey the Spaniards thither with them, or turn them off in a boat to make the best of their way to the coast of Hispaniola, which was but 10 miles off. This was the course urged by Blood himself. "There's nothing else to be done," he insisted. "In Tortuga they will be flayed alive, which is less than the swine deserve," growled Wolverstone. "And you'll remember, Peter," put in Hagthorpe, "that boy's threat to you this morning. If he escapes, and carries word of all this to his uncle, the admiral, the execution of that threat will become more than possible. It says much for Peter Blood that the argument should have left him unmoved. It is a little thing, perhaps, but in a narrative in which there is so much that tells against him, I cannot, since my story is in the nature of a brief of the defense, afford to slur a circumstance that is so strongly in his favor, a circumstance revealing that the cynicism attributed to him proceeded from his reason, and from a brooding over wrongs rather than from any natural instincts. I care nothing for his threats." "You should," said Wolverstone. "The wise thing be to hang him, along o' all the rest." "It is not human to be wise," said Blood. "It is much more human to err, though perhaps exceptional to err on the side of mercy, will be exceptional. Oh, faw! I've no stomach for cold-blooded killing. At daybreak pack the Spaniards into a boat with a keg of water and a sack of dumplings, and let them go to the devil. That was his last word on the subject, and it prevailed by virtue of the authority they had vested in him, and of which he had taken so firm a grip. At daybreak, Don Esteban and his followers were put off in a boat. 2 days later, the Cinco Llagas sailed into the rock-bound bay of Keona, which nature seemed to have designed for stronghold of those who had appropriated it. Chapter 13. Tortuga. It is time fully to disclose the fact that the survival of the story of Captain Blood's exploits is due entirely to the industry of Jeremy Pitt, the Somersetshire shipmaster. In addition to his ability as a navigator, this amiable young man appears to have wielded an indefatigable pen, and to have been inspired to indulge its fluency by the affection he very obviously bore to Peter Blood. He kept a log of the 40-gun frigate Arabella, on which he served as master, or, as we should say today, navigating officer, as no log that I have seen was ever kept. It runs into some 20-odd volumes of assorted sizes, some of which are missing altogether, and others of which are so sadly depleted of leaves as to be of little use. But if at times in a laborious perusal of them, they are preserved in the library of Mr. James Speke of Comerdon, I have inveighed against these lacunae. At others I have been equally troubled by the excessive prolixity of what remains and the difficulty of disintegrating from the confused whole the really essential parts. I have a suspicion that a squeameling, though how or where I can make no surmise, must have obtained access to these records, and that he plucked from them the brilliant feathers of several exploits to stick them into the tail of his own hero, Captain Morgan. But that is by the way. I mention it chiefly as a warning. For when presently I come to relate the affair of Maracaibo, those of you who have read A Squeameling may be in danger of supposing that Henry Morgan really performed those things which here are voraciously attributed to Peter Blood. I think, however, that when you come to weigh the motives actuating both Blood and the Spanish admiral in that affair, and when you consider how integrally the event is a part of Blood's history, whilst merely a detached incident in Morgan's, you will reach my own conclusion as to which is the real plagiarist. The first of these logs of Pitt's is taken up almost entirely with a retrospective narrative of the events up to the time of Blood's first coming to Tortuga. This and the Tannic collection of state trials are the chief, though not the only sources of my history so far. Pitt lays great stress upon the fact that it was the circumstances upon which I have dwelt, and these alone, that drove Peter Blood to seek an anchorage at Tortuga. He insists at considerable length, and with a vehemence which in itself makes it plain that an opposite opinion was held in some quarters, that it was no part of the design of Blood or of any of his companions of misfortune to join hands with the buccaneers who, under a semi-official French protection, made of Tortuga a lair whence they could sally out to drive their merciless piratical trade chiefly at the expense of Spain. It was, Pitt tells us, Blood's original intention to make his way to France or Holland. But in the long weeks of waiting for a ship to convey him to one or the other of these countries, his resources dwindled and finally vanished. Also, his chronicler thinks that he detected signs of some secret trouble in his friend, and he attributes to this the abuses of the potent West Indian spirit of which Blood became guilty in those days of inaction, thereby sinking to the level of the wild adventurers with whom ashore he associated. I do not think that Pitt is guilty in this merely of special pleading, that he is putting forward excuses for his hero. I think that in those days there was a good deal to press Peter Blood. There was a thought of Arabella Bishop, and that this thought loomed large in his mind we are not permitted to doubt. He was maddened by the tormenting lure of the unattainable. He desired Arabella, yet knew her beyond his reach irrevocably and for all time. Also, whilst he may have desired to go to France or Holland, he had no clear purpose to accomplish when he reached one or the other of these countries. He was, when all is said, an escaped slave, an outlaw in his own land, and a homeless outcast in any other. There remained the sea, which is free to all, and particularly alluring to those who feel themselves at war with humanity. And so, considering the adventurous spirit that once already had sent him a-roving for the sheer love of it, considering that the spirit was heightened now by a recklessness begotten of his outlawry, that his training and skill in militant seamanship clamorously supported the temptations that were put before him, can you wonder, or dare you blame him, that in the end he succumbed? And remember that these temptations proceeded not only from adventurous buccaneering acquaintances in the taverns of that evil haven of Tortuga, but even from M. D'Adran, the governor of the island, who levied as his harbor dues percentage of 1/10 of all spoils brought into the bay, and who profited further by commissions upon money, which he was desired to convert into bills of exchange upon France, a trade that might have worn a repellent aspect when urged by greasy, half-drunken adventurers. Bookhand hunters, lumbermen, beachcombers, English, French, and Dutch became a dignified, almost official form of privateering when advocated by the courtly, middle-aged gentleman who, in representing the French West India Company, seemed to represent France herself. Moreover, to a man, not excluding Jeremy Pitt himself, in whose blood the call of the sea was insistent and imperative, those who had escaped with Peter Blood from the Barbados plantations, and who, consequently, like himself, knew not whither to turn, were all resolved upon joining the great brotherhood of the coast, as those rovers called themselves. And they united theirs to the other voices that were persuading Blood, demanding that he should continue now in the leadership which he had enjoyed since they had left Barbados, and swear to follow him loyally whithersoever he should lead them. And so, to condense all that Jeremy has recorded in the matter, Blood ended by yielding to external and internal pressure, abandoned himself to the stream of destiny. Fata viam invenerant is his own expression of it. If he resisted so long, it was, I think, the thought of Arabella Bishop that restrained him. That they should be destined never to meet again did not weigh at first, or, indeed, ever. He conceived the scorn with which he would come to hear of his having turned pirate, and the scorn, though as yet no more than imagined, hurt him as if it were already reality. And even when he conquered this, still the thought of her was ever present. He compromised with the conscience that her memory kept so disconcertingly active. He vowed that the thought of her should continue ever before him to help him keep his hands as clean as a man might in this desperate trade upon which he was embarking. And so, although he might entertain no delusive hope of ever winning her for his own, of ever even seeing her again, yet the memory of her was to abide in his soul as a bittersweet, purifying influence. The love that is never to be realized will often remain a man's guiding ideal. The resolve being taken, he went actively to work. Adran, most accommodating of governors, advanced him money for the proper equipment of his ship, the Cinco Lagos, which he renamed the Arabella, this after some little hesitation, fearful of thus setting his heart upon his sleeve. But his Barbados friends accounted it merely an expression of the ever-ready irony in which their leader dealt. To the score of followers he already possessed, he added 80 more, picking his men with caution and discrimination, and he was an exceptional judge of men, from amongst the adventurers of Tortuga. With them all he entered into the articles usual among the brethren of the coast, under which each man was to be paid by a share in the prizes captured. In other respects, however, the articles were different. Aboard the Arabella, there was to be none of the ruffianly indiscipline that normally prevailed in buccaneering vessels. Those who shipped with him undertook obedience and submission in all things to himself and to the officers appointed by election. Any to whom this clause in the articles was distasteful might follow some other leader. Toward the end of December, when the hurricane season had blown itself out, he put to sea in his well-found, well-manned ship, and before he returned in the following May from a protracted and adventurous cruise, the fame of Captain Peter Blood had run like ripples before the breeze across the face of the Caribbean Sea. There was a fight in the windward passage at the outset with a Spanish galleon, which had resulted in the gutting and finally the sinking of the Spaniard. There was a daring raid effected by means of several appropriated piraguas upon a Spanish pearl fleet in the Rio de la Hacha, from which they had taken a particularly rich haul of pearls. There was an overland expedition to the gold fields of Santa Maria on the Main, the full tale of which is hardly credible, and there were lesser adventures through all of which the crew of the Arabella came with credit and profit, if not entirely unscathed. And so it happened that before the Arabella came homing to Tortuga in the following May to refit and repair, for she was not without scars, as you conceive. The fame of her and of Peter Blood, her captain, had swept from the Bahamas to the Windward Isles, from New Providence to Trinidad. An echo of it had reached Europe, and at the court of St. James's angry representations were made by the ambassador of Spain, to whom it was answered that it must not be supposed that this Captain Blood held any commission from the King of England, that he was, in fact, a proscribed rebel, an escaped slave, and that any measures against him by his Catholic Majesty would receive the cordial approbation of King James II. Don Miguel de Espinosa, the Admiral of Spain and the West Indies, and his nephew Don Esteban, who sailed with him, did not lack the will to bring the adventurer to the yardarm. With them, this business of capturing blood, which was now an international affair, was also a family matter. Spain, through the mouth of Don Miguel, did not spare her threats. The report of them reached Tortuga, and with it the assurance that Don Miguel had behind him not only the authority of his own nation, but that of the English king as well. It was a Brittum Fulman that inspired no terrors in Captain Blood, nor was he likely, on account of it, to allow himself to run to rust in the security of Tortuga. For what he had suffered at the hands of man, he had chosen to make Spain the scapegoat. Thus he accounted that he served a twofold purpose. He took compensation, at the same time served, not indeed the Stuart king, whom he despised, but England and, for that matter, all the rest of civilized mankind which cruel, treacherous, greedy, bigoted Castile sought to exclude from intercourse with the New World. One day, as he sat with Hagthorpe and Wolverstone over a pipe and a bottle of rum, in the stifling reek of tar and stale tobacco of a waterside tavern, he was accosted by a splendid ruffian in a gold-laced coat of dark blue satin, with a crimson sash, a foot wide, about the waist. "C'est vous qu'on appelle le sang?" the fellow hailed him. Captain Blood looked up to consider the questioner before replying. The man was tall and built on lines of agile strength, with a swarthy, aquiline face that was brutally handsome. A diamond of great price flamed on the indifferently clean hand resting on the pommel of his long rapier, and there were gold rings in his ears half concealed by long ringlets of oily chestnut hair. Captain Blood took the pipe stem from between his lips. "My name," he said, "is Peter Blood. The Spaniards know me for Don Pedro Sangre, and a Frenchman may call me Le Sang, if he pleases." "Good," said the gaudy adventurer in English, and without further invitation, he drew up a stool and sat down at that greasy table. "My name," he informed the three men, two of whom at least were eyeing him askance. "It is Le Vasseur. You may have heard of me." They had, indeed. He commanded a privateer of 20 guns that had dropped anchor in the bay a week ago, manned by a crew mainly composed of French falcon hunters from northern Hispaniola, men who had good cause to hate the Spaniard with an intensity exceeding that of the English. Le Vasseur had brought them back to Tortuga from an indifferently successful cruise. It would need more, however, than lack of success to abate the fellow's monstrous vanity. A roaring, quarrelsome, hard-drinking, hard-gaming scoundrel, his reputation as a buccaneer stood high among the wild brethren of the coast. He enjoyed also a reputation of another sort. There was about his gaudy, swaggering raffishness something that the women found singularly alluring. That he should boast openly of his bond's fortunes did not seem strange to Captain Blood. What he might have found strange was that there appeared to be some measure of justification for these boasts. It was current gossip that even Mademoiselle d'Ogeron, the governor's daughter, had been caught in the snare of his wild attractiveness, and that Le Vasseur had gone the length of audacity of asking her hand in marriage of her father. D'Ogeron had made him the only possible answer. He had shown him the door. Le Vasseur had departed in a rage, swearing that he would make Mademoiselle his wife in the teeth of all the fathers in Christendom, and that D'Ogeron should bitterly rue the affront he had put upon him. This was the man who now thrust himself upon Captain Blood with a proposal of association, offering him not only his sword, but his ship and the men who sailed in her. A dozen years ago, as a lad of barely 20, Le Vasseur had sailed with that monster of cruelty L'Olonaise, and his own subsequent exploits bore witness and did credit to the school in which he had been reared. I doubt if in his day there was a greater scoundrel among the brethren of the coast than this Le Vasseur. And yet, repulsive though he found him, Captain Blood could not deny that the fellow's proposals displayed boldness, imagination, and resource, and he was forced to admit that jointly they could undertake operations of a greater magnitude than was possible singly to either of them. The climax of Le Vasseur's project was to be a raid upon the wealthy mainland city of Maracaibo, but for this, he admitted, 600 men at the very least would be required, and 600 men were not to be conveyed in the two bottoms they now commanded. Preliminary cruises must take place, having for one of their objects the capture of further ships. Because he disliked the man, Captain Blood would not commit himself at once. but because he liked the proposal, he consented to consider it, being afterwards pressed by both Hagthorpe and Wolverstone, who did not share his own personal dislike of the Frenchman. The end of the matter was that within a week articles were drawn up between Levasseur and Blood, and signed by them and, as was usual, by the chosen representatives of their followers. These articles contained, inter alia, the common provisions that, should the two vessels separate, a strict account must afterwards be rendered of all prizes severally taken, whilst the vessel taking a prize should retain 3/5 of its value, surrendering 2/5 to its associate. These shares were subsequently to be subdivided among the crew of each vessel, in accordance with the articles already obtaining between each captain and his own men. For the rest, the articles contained all the clauses that were usual, among which was a clause that any man found guilty of abstracting or concealing any part of prize, be it the value of no more than a peso, should be summarily hanged from a yardarm. All being now settled, they made ready for sea, and on the very eve of sailing, Levasseur narrowly escaped being shot in a romantic attempt to scale the wall of the governor's garden, with the object of taking passionate leave of the infatuated Mademoiselle d'Ogeron. He desisted after having been twice fired upon from a fragrant ambush of pimento trees where the governor's guards were posted, and he departed vowing to take different and very definite measures on his return. That night he slept on board his ship, which with characteristic flamboyance he had named La Faudree, and there on the following day he received a visit from Captain Blood, whom he greeted half-mockingly as his admiral. The Irishman came to settle certain final details of which all that need concern us is an understanding that, in the event of the two vessels becoming separated by accident or design, they should rejoin each other as soon as might be at Tortuga. Thereafter Levasseur entertained his admiral to dinner, and jointly they drank success to the expedition. So copiously on the part of Levasseur that when the time came to separate, he was as nearly drunk as it seemed possible for him to be, and yet retain his understanding. Finally, towards evening, Captain Blood went over the side, and was rowed back to his great ship with her red bulwarks and gilded ports, touched into a lovely thing of flame by the setting sun. He was a little heavy-hearted. I have said that he was a judge of men, and his judgment of Levasseur filled him with misgivings, which were growing heavier in a measure as the hour of departure approached. He expressed it to Wolverstone, who met him as he stepped aboard the Arabella. "You overpersuaded me into those articles, you blackguard, and it'll surprise me if any good comes of this association." The giant rolled a single bloodthirsty eye and sneered, thrusting out his heavy jaw. "We'll wring the dog's neck if there's any treachery. So we will, if we are there to wring it by then. And on that, dismissing the matter, we sail in the morning on the first of the ebb," he announced, and went off to his cabin. Chapter 14. Levasseur's Heroics. It would be somewhere about 10 o'clock on the following morning, a full hour before the time appointed for sailing, when a canoe brought up alongside La Faudree, and a half-caste Indian stepped out of her and went up the ladder. He was clad in drawers of hairy, untanned hide, and a red blanket served him for a cloak. He was the bearer of a folded scrap of paper for Captain Levasseur. The captain unfolded the letter, sadly soiled and crumpled by contact with a half-caste person. Its contents may be roughly translated thus: "My well-beloved, I am in the Dutch brig Jongro, which is about to sail. Resolved to separate us forever, my cruel father is sending me to Europe in my brother's charge. I implore you, come to my rescue. Deliver me, my well-beloved hero, your desolated Madeline, who loves you." The well-beloved hero was moved to the soul of him by that passionate appeal. His scowling glance swept the bay for the Dutch brig, which he knew had been due to sail for Amsterdam with a cargo of hides and tobacco. She was nowhere to be seen among the shipping in that narrow, rock-bound harbor. He roared out the question in his mind. In answer, the half-caste pointed out beyond the frothing surf that marked the position of the reef constituting one of the stronghold's main defenses. Away beyond it, a mile or so distant, a sail was standing out to sea. "There she go," he said. "There!" The Frenchman gazed and stared, his face growing white. The man's wicked temper awoke, and turned to vent itself upon the messenger. "And where have you been that you come here only now with this? Answer me." The half-caste shrank terrified before his fury. His explanation, if he had one, was paralyzed by fear. Levasseur took him by the throat, shook him twice, snarling the while, then hurled him into the scuppers. The The man's head struck the gunwale as he fell, and he lay there, quite still, a trickle of blood issuing from his mouth. Levasseur dashed one hand against the other, as if dusting them. Heave that muck overboard. He ordered some of those who stood idling in the waist, then up anchor and let us after the Dutchman. Steady, Captain. What's that? There was a restraining hand upon his shoulder, and the broad face of his Lieutenant Cahusac, a burly, callous Breton scoundrel, was stolidly confronting him. Levasseur made clear his purpose with a deal of unnecessary obscenity. Cahusac shook his head. "A Dutch brig," said he. "Impossible. We should never be allowed. And who the devil will deny us?" Levasseur was between amazement and fury. For one thing, there's your own crew will be none too willing. For another, there's Captain Blood. I care nothing for Captain Blood, but it is necessary that you should. He has the power, the weight of metal and of men, and if I know him at all, he'll sink us before he'll suffer interference with the Dutch. He has his own views of privateering, this Captain Blood, as I warned you. "Ah!" said Levasseur, showing his teeth, but his eyes, riveted upon that distant sail, were gloomily thoughtful. Not for long. The imagination and resource which Captain Blood had detected in the fellow soon suggested a course. Cursing in his soul, and even before the anchor was weighed, the association into which it entered, he was already studying ways of evasion. What Cahusac implied was true. Blood would never suffer violence to be done in his presence to a Dutchman, but it might be done in his absence, and being done, Blood must perforce condone it, since it would then be too late to protest. Within the hour, the Arabella and La Foudre were beating out to sea together. Without understanding the change of plan involved, Captain Blood, nevertheless, accepted it, and weighed anchor before the appointed time upon perceiving his associate to do so. All day the Dutch brig was in sight, though by evening she had dwindled to the merest speck on the northern horizon. The course prescribed for Blood and Levasseur lay eastward along the northern shores of Hispaniola. To that course the Arabella continued to hold steadily throughout the night. When day broke again, she was alone. La Foudre, under cover of the darkness, had struck away to the northeast with every rag of canvas on her yards. Cahusac had attempted yet again to protest against this. "The devil take you!" Levasseur had answered him. "A ship's a ship, be she Dutch or Spanish, and ships are our present need. That will suffice for the men." His lieutenant said no more, but from his glimpse of the letter, knowing that a girl and not a ship was his captain's real objective, he gloomily shook his head as he rolled away on his bowed legs to give the necessary orders. Dawn found La Foudre close on the Dutchman's heels, not a mile astern, and the sight of her very evidently flustered the jongleur. No doubt Mademoiselle's brother, recognizing Levasseur's ship, would be responsible for the Dutch uneasiness. They saw the jongleur crowding canvas in a futile endeavor to outsail them, whereupon they stood off to starboard and raced on until they were in a position whence they could send a warning shot across her bow. The jongleur veered, showed them her rudder, and opened fire with her stern chasers. The small shot went whistling through La Foudre's shrouds with some slight damage to her canvas. Followed a brief running fight in the course, of which the Dutchman let fly a broadside. 5 minutes after that they were board and board. The jongleur held tight in the clutches of La Foudre's grapnels, and the buccaneers pouring noisily into her waist. The Dutchman's master, purple in the face, stood forward to beard the pirate, followed closely by an elegant, pale-faced young gentleman in whom Levasseur recognized his brother-in-law-elect. "Captain Levasseur, this is an outrage for which you shall be made to answer. What do you seek aboard my ship? At first I sought only that which belongs to me, something of which I am being robbed. But since you chose war and opened fire on me with some damage to my ship and loss of life to 5 of my men, why, war it is, and your ship a prize of war." From the quarter rail Mademoiselle d'Audran looked down with glowing eyes in breathless wonder upon her well-beloved hero. Gloriously heroic he seemed as he stood towering there, masterful, audacious, beautiful. He saw her, and with a glad shout sprang towards her. The Dutch master got his way with hands upheld to arrest his progress. Levasseur did not stay to argue with him. He was too impatient to reach his mistress. He swung the poleaxe that he carried, and the Dutchman went down in blood with a cloven skull. The eager lover stepped across the body and came on, his countenance joyously alight. But Mademoiselle was shrinking now in horror. She was a girl upon the threshold of glorious womanhood, of a fine height and nobly molded, with heavy coils of glossy black hair above and about a face that was the color of old ivory. Her countenance was cast in lines of arrogance, stressed by the low lids of her full dark eyes. In a bound her well-beloved was beside her, flinging away his bloody poleaxe. He opened wide his arms to enfold her, but she still shrank even within his embrace, which would not be denied. A look of dread had come to temper the normal arrogance of her almost perfect face. Mine at last, and in spite of all, he cried exultantly, theatrically, truly heroic. But she, endeavoring to thrust him back, her hands against his breast, could only falter, "Why? Why did you kill him?" He laughed as a hero should, and answered her heroically, with the tolerance of a god for the mortal to whom he condescends. He stood between us. Let his death be a symbol, a warning. Let all who would stand between us mark it and beware. It was so splendidly terrific. The gesture, it was so broad and fine, and his magnetism so compelling, that she cast her silly tremors and yielded herself freely, intoxicated, to his fond embrace. Thereafter he swung her to his shoulder, and stepping with ease beneath that burden, bore her in a sort of triumph, lustily cheered by his men, to the deck of his own ship. Her inconsiderate brother might have ruined that romantic scene, but for the watchful Cahusac, who quietly tripped him up and then trussed him like a fowl. Thereafter, what time the captain languished in his lady's smile within the cabin, Cahusac was dealing with the spoils of war. The Dutch crew was ordered into the longboat and bidden go to the devil. Fortunately, as they numbered fewer than 30, the longboat, though perilously overcrowded, could yet contain them. Next, Cahusac, having inspected the cargo, put a quartermaster and a score of men aboard the Jombro, and left her to follow La Faudree, which he now headed south for the Leeward Islands. Cahusac was disposed to be ill-humored. The risk they had run in taking the Dutch brig and doing violence to members of the family of the governor of Tortuga was out of all proportion to the value of their prize. He said so, sullenly, to Le Vasseur. "You'll keep that opinion to yourself," the captain answered him. "Don't think I am a man to thrust my neck into a noose without knowing how I am going to take it out again. I shall send an offer of terms to the governor of Tortuga that he will be forced to accept. Set a course for the Virgin Magra. We'll go ashore and settle things from there, and tell them to fetch that milksop Audron to the cabin." Le Vasseur went back to the adoring lady. Thither, too, the lady's brother was presently conducted. The captain rose to receive him, bending his stalwart height to avoid striking the cabin roof with his head. Mademoiselle rose too. "Why this?" she asked Le Vasseur, pointing to her brother's pinioned wrists, the remains of Cahusac's precautions. "I deplore it," said he. "I desire to end. Let him, Diodron, give me parole." "I give you nothing," flashed the white-faced youth, who did not lack for spirit. "You see." Le Vasseur shrugged his deep regret, and Mademoiselle turned protesting to her brother. "Henri, this is foolish. You are not behaving as my friend." "You!" "Little fool," her brother answered her, and the little was out of place. She was the taller of the twain. "Little fool, do you think I should be acting as your friend to make terms with this blackguard pirate?" "Steady, my young cockerel." Le Vasseur laughed, but his laugh was not nice. "Don't you perceive your wicked folly and the harm it has brought already? Lives have been lost, men have died, that this monster might overtake you. And don't you yet realize where you stand? In the power of this beast, of this cur born in a kennel and bred in thieving and murder." He might have said more, but that Le Vasseur struck him across the mouth. Le Vasseur, you see, cared as little as another to hear the truth about himself. Mademoiselle suppressed a scream, as the youth staggered back under the blow. He came to rest against a bulkhead, and leaned there with bleeding lips. But his spirit was unquenched, and there was a ghastly smile on his white face as his eyes sought his sister's. "You see," he said simply, "he strikes a man whose hands are bound." The simple words, and more than the words, their tone of ineffable disdain, aroused a passion that never slumbered deeply in Le Vasseur. And what should you do, puppy, if your hands were unbound? He took his prisoner by the breast of his doublet and shook him. "Answer me," What should you do? Cha! You empty windbag. You! And then came a torrent of words unknown to Mademoiselle, yet whose foulness her intuitions made her conscious. With blanched cheeks, she stood by the cabin table and cried out to Levasseur to stop, to obey her. He opened the door and flung her brother through it. "Put that rubbish under hatches until I call for it again," he roared, and shut the door. Composing himself, he turned to the girl again with a deprecatory smile. But no smile answered him from her set face. She had seen her beloved hero's nature in curl papers, as it were, and she found the spectacle disgusting and terrifying. It recalled the brutal slaughter of the Dutch captain, and suddenly she realized that what her brother had just said of this man was no more than true. Fear growing to panic was written on her face, as she stood there leaning for support against the table. "Why, sweetheart, what is this?" Levasseur moved towards her. She recoiled before him. There was a smile on his face, a glitter in his eyes that fetched her heart into her throat. He caught her as she reached the uttermost limits of the cabin, seized her in his long arms, and pulled her to him. "No, no," she panted. "Yes, yes." He mocked her, and his mockery was the most terrible thing of all. He crushed her to him brutally, deliberately hurtful because she resisted, and kissed her while she writhed in his embrace. Then, his passion mounting, he grew angry and stripped off the last rag of hero's mask that still may have hung upon his face. "Little fool, did you not hear your brother say that you are in my power? Remember it, and remember that of your own free will you came. I am not the man with whom a woman can play fast and loose. So get sense, my girl, and accept what you have invited." He kissed her again, almost contemptuously, and flung her off. "No more scowls," he said. "You'll be sorry else." Someone knocked. Cursing the interruption, Levasseur strode off to open. Cahusac stood before him. The Breton's face was grave. He came to report that they had sprung a leak between wind and water, the consequence of damage sustained from one of the Dutchman's shots. In alarm, Levasseur went off with him. The leakage was not serious, so long as the weather kept fine, but should a storm overtake them, it might speedily become so. A man was slung overboard to make a partial stoppage with a sailcloth, and the pumps were got to work. Ahead of them a low cloud showed on the horizon, which Cahusac pronounced one of the northernmost of the Virgin Islands. "We must run for shelter there and careen her," said Levasseur. "I do not trust this oppressive heat. A storm may catch us before we make land." "A storm or something else," said Cahusac grimly. "Have you noticed that?" He pointed away to starboard. Levasseur looked and caught his breath. Two ships that at the distance seemed a considerable burden were heading towards him some 5 miles away. "If they follow us, what is to happen?" demanded Cahusac. "We'll fight whether we're in case to do so or not," swore Levasseur. Counsels of despair. Cahusac was contemptuous. To mark it, he spat upon the deck. "This comes of going to sea with a lovesick madman. Now, keep your temper, Captain, for the hands will be at the end of theirs if we have trouble as a result of this Dutchman business." For the remainder of that day, Levasseur's thoughts were of anything but love. He remained on deck, his eyes now upon the land, now upon those two slowly gaining ships. To run for the open could avail him nothing, and in his leaky condition would provide an additional danger. He must stand at bay and fight. And then, towards evening, when within 3 miles ashore and when he was about to give the order to strip for battle, he almost fainted from relief to hear a voice from the crow's nest above announce that the larger of the two ships was the Arabella. Her companion was presumably a prize. But the pessimism of Cahusac abetted nothing. "That is but the lesser evil," he growled. "What will Blood say about this Dutchman?" "Let him say what he pleases." Levasseur laughed in the immensity of his relief. "And what about the children of the governor of Tortuga?" "He must not know. He'll come to know in the end." "Aye, but by then, Morbleu, the matter will be settled. I shall have made my peace with the governor. I tell you, I know the way to compel Audran to come to terms." Presently the 4 vessels laid off the northern coast of La Virgin Magra, a narrow little island arid and treeless, some 12 miles by 3, uninhabited save by bird and turtles, and unproductive of anything but salt, of which there were considerable ponds to the south. Levasseur put off in a boat accompanied by Cahusac and 2 other officers, and went to visit Captain Blood aboard the Arabella. "Our brief separation has been mighty profitable," was Captain Blood's greeting. "It's a busy morning we've both had." He was in high good humor as he led the way to the great cabin for a rendering of accounts. The tall ship that accompanied the Arabella was a Spanish vessel of 26 guns. The Santiago from Puerto Rico with 120,000 weight of cacao, 40,000 pieces of 8, and the value of 10,000 more in jewels. A rich capture which 2/5 under the articles went to Levasseur and his crew. Of the money and jewels of division was made on the spot. The cacao, it was agreed, should be taken to Tortuga to be sold. Then it was a turn of Levasseur, and black grew the brow of Captain Blood as the Frenchman's tale was unfolded. At the end, he roundly expressed his disapproval. The Dutch were a friendly people whom it was a folly to alienate, particularly for so paltry a matter as these hides and tobacco, which at most would fetch a bear 20,000 pieces. But Levasseur answered him, as he had answered Cahusac, that a ship was a ship, and it was ships they needed against a projected enterprise. Perhaps because things had gone well with him that day, Blood ended by shrugging the matter aside. Thereupon Levasseur proposed that the Arabella and her prize should return to Tortuga there to unload the cacao and enlist the further adventurers that could now be shipped. Levasseur meanwhile would effect certain necessary repairs, and then proceeding south, await his admiral at Saltatudos, an island conveniently situated in the latitude of 11 degrees, 11 foot and for their enterprise against Maracaibo. To Levasseur's relief, Captain Blood not only agreed, but pronounced himself ready to set sail at once. No sooner had the Arabella departed than Levasseur brought his ships into the lagoon and set his crew to work upon the erection of temporary quarters ashore for himself, his men, and his enforced guests during the careening and repairing of La Foudre. At sunset that evening the wind freshened. It grew to a gale, and from that to such a hurricane that Levasseur was thankful to find himself ashore and his ships in safe shelter. He wondered a little how it might be faring with Captain Blood out there at the mercy of that terrific storm, but he did not permit concern to trouble him unduly. Chapter 15. The Ransom. In the glory of the following morning, sparkling and clear after the storm, with an invigorating, briny tang in the air from the salt ponds on the south of the island, a curious scene was played on the beach of the Virgin Magra, at the foot of a ridge of bleached dunes, beside the spread of sail from which Levasseur had improvised a tent. Enthroned upon an empty cask sat the French filibuster to transact important business. The business of making himself safe with the governor of Tortuga. A guard of honor of a half-dozen officers hung about him. 5 of them were rude book-in hunters, in stained jerkins and leather breeches. The 6th was Cahusac. Before him, guarded by 2 half-naked Negroes, stood young Diadron, in frilled shirt and satin small clothes and fine shoes of cordovan leather. He was stripped of doublet, and his hands were tied behind him. The young gentleman's comely face was haggard. Near at hand, and also under guard, but unpinioned, Mademoiselle, his sister, sat hunched upon a hillock of sand. She was very pale, and it was in vain that she sought to veil in a mass of arrogance the fears by which she was assailed. Levasseur addressed himself to M. Diadron. He spoke at long length. In the end, "I trust, monsieur," said he with mock suavity, "that I have made myself quite clear, so that there may be no misunderstandings. I will recapitulate. Your ransom is fixed at 20,000 pieces of 8, and you shall have liberty on parole to go to Tortuga to collect it. In fact, I shall provide the means to convey you thither, and you shall have a month in which to come and go. Meanwhile, your sister remains with me as a hostage. Your father should not consider such a sum excessive as the price of his son's liberty and to provide a dowry for his daughter. Indeed, if anything, I am too modest, party. Diadron is reputed a wealthy man. Diadron the younger raised his head and looked the captain boldly in the face. I refuse, utterly and absolutely. Do you understand? So do your worst, and be damned for a filthy pirate without decency and without honor. But what words, laughed Levasseur. What heat and what foolishness. You have not considered the alternative. When you do, you will not persist in your refusal. You will not do that in any case. We have spurs for the reluctant, and I warn you against giving me your parole under stress, and afterwards playing me false. I shall know how to find and punish you. Meanwhile, remember your sister's honor is in pawn to me. Should you forget to return with the dowry, you will not consider it unreasonable that I forget to marry her. Levasseur's smiling eyes, intent upon the young man's face, saw the horror that crept into his glance. Deirdre cast a wild glance at Mademoiselle and observed the gray despair that had almost stamped the beauty from her face. Disgust and fury swept across his countenance. Then he braced himself and answered resolutely, "No, you dog! 1,000 times, no. You are foolish to persist." Levasseur spoke without anger, with a coldly mocking regret. His fingers had been busy tying knots in a length of whipcord. He held it up. "You know this? It is a rosary of pain that has wrought the conversion of many a stubborn heretic. It is capable of screwing the eyes out of a man's head by way of helping him to see reason. As you please." He flung the length of knotted cord to one of the Negroes, who in an instant made it fast about the prisoner's brows. Then between cord and cranium the black inserted a short length of metal, round and slender as a pipe stem. That done, he rolled his eyes towards Levasseur, awaiting the captain's signal. Levasseur considered his victim, and beheld him tense and braced, his haggard face of a leaden hue, beads of perspiration glinting on his pallid brow, just beneath the whipcord. Mademoiselle cried out and would have risen, but her guards restrained her, and she sank down again, moaning. "I beg that you will spare yourself and your sister," said the captain, "by being reasonable. What, after all, is the sum I have named? To your wealthy father a bagatelle. I repeat, I have been too modest. But since I have said 20,000 pieces of 8, 20,000 pieces it shall be. And for what, if you please, have you said 20,000 pieces of 8? In execrable French, but in a voice that was crisp and pleasant, seeming to echo some of the mockery that had invested Levasseur's. That question floated over their heads. Startled, Levasseur and his officers looked up and round, on the crest of the dunes behind them. In sharp silhouette against the deep cobalt of the sky, they beheld a tall, lean figure scrupulously dressed in black with silver lace, a crimson ostrich plume curled about the broad brim of his hat, affording the only touch of color. Under that hat was the tawny face of Captain Blood. Levasseur gathered himself up with an oath of amazement. He had conceived Captain Blood by now well below the horizon, on his way to Tortuga, assuming him to have been so fortunate as to have weathered last night's storm, launching himself upon the yielding sand, into which he sank to the level of the calves of his fine boots of Spanish leather. Captain Blood came sliding erect to the beach. He was followed by Wolverstone and a dozen others. As he came to a standstill, he doffed his hat, with a flourish, to the lady. Then he turned to Levasseur. "Good morning, my captain," said he, and proceeded to explain his presence. "It was last night's hurricane compelled our return. We had no choice but to ride before it with strip poles, and it drove us back the way we had gone. Moreover, as the devil would have it, the Santiago sprang her mainmast, and so I was glad to put into a cove on the west of the island a couple of miles away, and we walked across to stretch our legs, and to give you good day. But who are these?" And he designated the man and the woman. Cahusac shrugged his shoulders and tossed his long arms to heaven. "Voila!" said he pregnantly to the firmament. Levasseur gnawed his lip and changed color, but he controlled himself to answer civilly. "As you see, 2 prisoners." "Ah, washed ashore in last night's gale." "Eh? Not so." Levasseur contained himself with difficulty before that irony. "They were in the Dutch brig." "I don't remember that you mentioned them before." "I did not. They are prisoners of my own. A personal matter. They are French." "French." Captain Blood's light eyes stabbed at Levasseur, then at the prisoners. Deirdre stood tense and braced as before, but the gray horror had left his face. Hope had leapt within him at this interruption, obviously as little expected by his tormentor as by himself. His sister, moved by a similar intuition, was leaning forward with parted lips and gaping eyes. Captain Blood fingered his lip and frowned thoughtfully upon Levasseur. "Yesterday you surprised me by making war upon the friendly Dutch. But now it seems that not even your own countrymen are safe from you. Have I not said that this is a matter personal to me? Ah, and their names." Captain Blood's crisp, authoritative, faintly disdainful manner stirred Levasseur's quick anger. The blood crept slowly back into his blenched face, and his glance grew in insolence, almost in menace. Meanwhile, the prisoner answered for him. I am Henri Diadron, and this is my sister. Dodgerin, Captain Blood stared. Are you related by chance to my good friend the governor of Tortuga? He is my father. Lay Vassar swung aside with an imprecation. In Captain Blood, amazement for the moment quenched every other emotion. The saints preserve us now. Are you quite mad, Lay Vassar? First you molest the Dutch, who are our friends. Next you take prisoners 2 persons that are French, your own countrymen. And now, faith, they're no less than the children of the governor of Tortuga, which is the one safe place of shelter that we enjoy in these islands. Lay Vassar broke in angrily. Must I tell you again that it is a matter personal to me? I make myself alone responsible to the governor of Tortuga. And the 20,000 pieces of 8, is that also a matter personal to you? It is. Now I don't agree with you at all. Captain Blood sat down on the cask that Lay Vassar had lately occupied and looked up blandly. I may inform you, to save time, that I heard the entire proposal that you made to this lady and this gentleman. And I'll also remind you that we sail under articles that admit no ambiguities. You have fixed their ransom at 20,000 pieces of 8. That sum then belongs to your crews, and mine in the proportions by the articles established. You'll hardly wish to dispute it. But what is far more grave is that you have concealed from me this part of the prizes taken on your last cruise, and for such an offense as that the articles provide certain penalties that are something severe in character. Ho, ho! Laughed Lay Vassar unpleasantly, then added, if you dislike my conduct, we could dissolve the association. That is my intention, but we'll dissolve it when and in the manner that I choose, and that will be as soon as you have satisfied the articles under which we sailed upon this cruise. What do you mean? I'll be as short as I can, said Captain Blood. I'll waive for the moment the unseemliness of making war upon the Dutch, of taking French prisoners, and provoking the anger of the governor of Tortuga. I'll accept the situation as I find it. Yourself you fixed the ransom of this couple at 20,000 pieces, and as I gather, the lady is to be your perquisite. But why should she be your perquisite more than another's, seeing that she belongs by the articles to all of us, as a prize of war? Black as thunder grew the brow of Lay Vassar. However, added Captain Blood, I'll not dispute her to you if you are prepared to buy her. Buy her? At the price you have set upon her. Lay Vassar contained his rage, that he might reason with the Irishman. That is the ransom of the man. It is to be paid for him by the governor of Tortuga. No, UVE parcel the twain together. Very oddly, I confess. UVE set their value at 20,000 pieces, and for that sum you may have them, since you desire it. But you'll pay from the 20,000 pieces that are ultimately to come to you as a ransom of one and the dowry of the other, and that sum shall be divided among our crews. So that you do that, it is conceivable that our followers may take a lenient view of your breach of the articles we jointly signed. Lay Vassar laughed savagely. Assez, credu, the good jest. I quite agree with you, said Captain Blood. To Lay Vassar, the jest lay in that Captain Blood, with no more than a dozen followers, should come there attempting to hector him who had 100 men within easy call. But it seemed that he had left out of his reckoning something which his opponent had counted in. For as, laughing still, Lay Vassar swung to his officers, he saw that which choked the laughter in his throat. Captain Blood had shrewdly played upon the cupidity that was a paramount inspiration of those adventurers, and Lay Vassar now read clearly on their faces how completely they adopted Captain Blood's suggestion that all must participate in the ransom which their leader had thought to appropriate to himself. It gave the gaudy ruffian pause, and whilst in his heart he cursed those followers of his who could be faithful only to their greed, he perceived, and only just in time, that he had best tread warily. You misunderstand, he said, swallowing his rage. The ransom is for division when it comes. The girl, meanwhile, is mine on that understanding. Good, grunted Cossack. On that understanding all arranges itself. You think so, said Captain Blood. But if Diadron should refuse to pay the ransom, what then? He laughed and got lazily to his feet. No. If Captain Lay Vassar is meanwhile to keep the girl, as he proposes, then let him pay this ransom, and be as the risk if it should afterwards not be forthcoming. That's it, cried one of Lay Vassar's officers. And Cossack added, it's reasonable that, Captain Blood is right. It is in the articles. What is in the articles, you fools? Leigh Vassar was in danger of losing his head. Sacred Jew, where do you suppose that I have 20,000 pieces? My whole share of the prizes of this cruise does not come half that sum. I'll be your debtor until I've earned it. Will that content you? All things considered, there is not a doubt that would have done so had not Captain Blood intended otherwise. And if you should die before you have earned it, ours is a calling fraught with risks, my captain. Damn you! Leigh Vassar flung upon him livid with fury. Will nothing satisfy you? Oh, but yes, 20,000 pieces of 8 for immediate division. I haven't got it. Then let someone buy the prisoners who has. And who do you suppose has it if I have not? I have, said Captain Blood. You have? Leigh Vassar's mouth fell open. You want the girl? Why not? And I exceed you in gallantry in that I will make sacrifices to obtain her, and honesty in that I am ready to pay for what I want. Leigh Vassar stared at him foolishly agape. Behind him pressed his officers. Gaping also, Captain Blood sat down again on the cask, and drew from an inner pocket of his doublet a little leather bag. I am glad to be able to resolve a difficulty that at one moment seemed insoluble, and under the bulging eyes of Leigh Vassar and his officers, he untied them out of the bag and rolled into his left palm 4 or 5 pearls, each the size of a sparrow's egg. There were 20 such in the bag, the very pick of those taken in that raid upon the pearl fleet. You boast a knowledge of pearls, Cahusac. At what do you value this? The Breton took between coarse finger and thumb the proffered lustrous, delicately iridescent sphere, his shrewd eyes appraising it. 8,000 pieces, he answered shortly. It will fetch rather more in Tortuga or Jamaica, said Captain Blood, and twice as much in Europe. But I'll accept your valuation. They are almost of a size, as you can see. Here are 12, representing 12,000 pieces of 8, which is law footer's share of 3/5 of the prize, as provided by the articles. For the 8,000 pieces that go to the Arabella, I make myself responsible to my own men. And now, Wolverstone, if you please, will you take my property aboard the Arabella? He stood up again, indicating the prisoners. Ah, no! Leigh Vassar threw wide the floodgates of his fury. Ah, that, no, by example, you shall not take her. He would have sprung upon Captain Blood, who stood aloof, alert, tight-lipped, and watchful, but it was one of Leigh Vassar's own officers who hindered him. Nom de Dieu, my captain, what will you do? It is settled. Honorably settled with satisfaction to all. To all, blazed Leigh Vassar. I say, to all of you, you animals. But what of me? Cahusac, with the pearls clutched in his capacious hand, stepped up to him on the other side. Don't be a fool, Captain. Do you want to provoke trouble between the crews? His men outnumber us by nearly 2 to 1. What's a girl more or less? In heaven's name, let her go. He's paid handsomely for her, and dealt fairly with us. Dealt fairly? Roared the infuriated captain. You! In all his foul vocabulary, he could find no epithet to describe his lieutenant. He caught him a blow that almost sent him sprawling. The pearls were scattered in the sand. Cahusac dived after them, his fellows with him. Vengeance must wait. For some moments they groped there on hands and knees, oblivious of all else. And yet, in those moments, vital things were happening. Leigh Vassar, his hand on his sword, his face a white mask of rage, was confronting Captain Blood to hinder his departure. You do not take her while I live, he cried. Then I'll take her when you're dead, said Captain Blood, and his own blade flashed in the sunlight. The articles provide that any man of whatever rank concealing any part of prize, be it of the value of no more than a peso, shall be hanged at the yardarm. It's what I intended for you in the end. But since you prefer it this way, you muckrake. Faith, I'll be humoring you. He waved away the men who would have interfered, and the blades rang together. Diadron looked on, a man bemused, unable to surmise what the issue either way could mean for him. Meanwhile, 2 of Blood's men who had taken the place of the Frenchman's Negro guards had removed the crown of whipcord from his brow. As for Mademoiselle, she had risen, and was leaning forward, a hand pressed tightly to her heaving breast, her face deathly pale, a wild terror in her eyes. It was soon over. The brute strength, upon which Leigh Vassar so confidently counted, could avail nothing against the Irishman's practiced skill. When, with both lungs transfixed, he lay prone on the white sand, coughing out his rascally life, Captain Blood looked calmly at Cahusac across the body. "I think that cancels the articles between us," he said, with soulless, cynical eyes. Cahusac considered the twitching body of his recent leader. Had Leif Vasseur been a man of different temper, the affair might have ended in a very different manner. But then, it is certain that Captain Blood would have adopted in dealing with him different tactics. As it was, Leif Vasseur commanded neither love nor loyalty. The men who followed him were the very dregs of that vile trade, and cupidity was their only inspiration. Upon that cupidity Captain Blood had deftly played, until they brought them to find Leif Vasseur guilty of the one offense they deemed unpardonable, the crime of appropriating to himself something which might be converted into gold and shared amongst them all. Thus now the threatening mob of buccaneers that came hastening to the theater of that swift tragi comedy were appeased by a dozen words of Cahusac's. While still they hesitated, Blood added something to quicken their decision. "If you will come to our anchorage, you shall receive at once your share of the booty of the Santiago, that you may dispose of it as you please." They crossed the island, the 2 prisoners accompanying them, and later that day, the division made, they would have parted company but that Cahusac, at the instances of the men who had elected him Leif Vasseur's successor, offered Captain Blood anew the services of that French contingent. "If you will sail with me again," the captain answered him, "you may do so on the condition that you make your peace with the Dutch and restore the brig and her cargo." The condition was accepted, and Captain Blood went off to find his guests, the children of the governor of Tortuga, Mademoiselle Diadron and her brother. The latter, now relieved of his bonds, sat in the great cabin of the Arabella, whither they had been conducted. Wine and food had been placed upon the table by Benjamin, Captain Blood's Negro steward and cook, who had intimated to them that it was for their entertainment, but it had remained untouched. Brother and sister sat there in agonized bewilderment, conceiving that their escape was but from frying pan to fire. At length, overwrought by the suspense, Mademoiselle flung herself upon her knees before her brother to implore his pardon for all the evil brought upon them by her wicked folly. Diadron was not in a forgiving mood. "I am glad that at least you realize what you have done. And now this other filibuster has bought you, and you belong to him. You realize that too, I hope." He might have said more, but he checked upon perceiving that the door was opening. Captain Blood, coming from settling matters with the followers of Leif Vasseur, stood on the threshold. Diadron had not troubled to restrain his high-pitched voice, and the captain had overheard the Frenchman's last 2 sentences. Therefore he perfectly understood why Mademoiselle should bound up at sight of him and shrink back in fear. "Mademoiselle," said he in his vile but fluent French, "I beg you to dismiss your fears. Aboard this ship you shall be treated with all honor. So soon as we are in case to put to sea again, we steer a course for Tortuga to take you home to your father. And pray do not consider that I have bought you, as your brother has just said. All that I have done has been to provide the ransom necessary to bribe a gang of scoundrels to depart from obedience to the arch-scoundrel who commanded them, and so deliver you from all peril. Count it, if you please, a friendly loan to be repaid entirely at your convenience." Mademoiselle stared at him in unbelief. Diadron rose to his feet. "Monsieur, is it possible that you are serious?" "I am. It may not happen often nowadays. I may be a pirate, but my ways are not the ways of Leif Vasseur, who should have stayed in Europe and practiced purse-cutting. I have a sort of honor, shall we say, some rags of honor, remaining me from better days." Then on a brisker note he added, "We dine in an hour, and I trust that you will honor my table with your company. Meanwhile, Benjamin will see, monsieur, that you are more suitably provided in the matter of wardrobe." He bowed to them and turned to depart again, but Mademoiselle detained him. "Monsieur!" she cried sharply. He checked and turned, while slowly she approached him, regarding him between dread and wonder. "Oh, you are noble. I shouldn't put it as high as that myself," said he. You are, and it is but right that you should know all." "Madeline!" her brother cried out to restrain her, but she would not be restrained. Her surcharged heart must overflow in confidence. "Monsieur, For what befell I am greatly at fault. This man, this Levasseur, he stared, incredulous in his turn. My God, is it possible? That animal. Abruptly, she fell on her knees, caught his hand and kissed it before he could wrench it from her. What do you do? He cried. And Armand, in my mind I dishonored you by deeming you as by conceiving your fight with Levasseur a combat between jackals. On my knees, monsieur, I implore you to forgive me. Captain Blood looked down upon her, and a smile broke on his lips, irradiating the blue eyes that looked so oddly light in that tawny face. Why, child, said he, I might find it hard to forgive you the stupidity of having thought otherwise. As he handed her to her feet again, he assured himself that he had behaved rather well in the affair. Then he sighed. That dubious fame of his that had spread so quickly across the Caribbean would by now have reached the ears of Arabella Bishop. That she would despise him, he could not doubt, deeming him no better than all the other scoundrels who drove this villainous buccaneering trade. Therefore he hoped that some echo of this deed might reach her also, and be set by her against some of that contempt. For the whole truth, which he withheld from Mademoiselle d'Audran, was that in venturing his life to save her, he had been driven by the thought that the deed must be pleasing the eyes of Miss Bishop, could she but witness it. Chapter 16. The Trap. That affair Mademoiselle d'Audran bore, as its natural fruit and improvement, in the already cordial relations between Captain Blood and the Governor Tortuga, at the fine stone house, with its green jalousied windows, which M. d'Audran had built himself in a spacious and luxuriant garden to the east of Keona. The captain became a very welcome guest. D'Audran was in the captain's debt for more than the 20,000 pieces of 8 which he had provided for Mademoiselle's ransom, and shrewd, hard bargain driver though he might be, the Frenchman could be generous and understood the sentiment of gratitude. This he now proved in every possible way, and under his powerful protection the credit of Captain Blood among the buccaneers very rapidly reached its zenith. So when it came to fitting out his fleet for that enterprise against Maracaibo, which had originally been Levasseur's project, he did not want for either ships or men to follow him. He recruited 500 adventurers in all, and he might have had as many thousands if he could have offered them accommodation. Similarly, without difficulty, he might have increased his fleet to twice its strength of ships, but that he preferred to keep it what it was. The 3 vessels to which he confined it were the Arabella, the La Foudre, which Cahusac now commanded with a contingent of some 60 Frenchmen, and the Santiago, which had been refitted and rechristened the Elizabeth, after that Queen of England whose seamen had humbled Spain as Captain Blood now hoped to humble it again. Hagthorpe, in virtue of his service in the Navy, was appointed by Blood to command her, and the appointment was confirmed by the men. It was some months after the rescue of Mademoiselle d'Audran, in August of that year 1687, that this little fleet, after some minor adventures which I pass over in silence, sailed into the great lake of Maracaibo and effected its raid upon that opulent city of the Main. The affair did not proceed exactly as was hoped, and Blood's force came to find itself in a precarious position. This is best explained in the words employed by Cahusac, which Pitt has carefully recorded, in the course of an altercation that broke out on the steps of the church of Nuestra Senora del Carmen, which Captain Blood had impiously appropriated for the purpose of a court-guard. I have said already that he was a papist only when it suited him. The dispute was being conducted by Hagthorpe, Wolverstone, and Pitt on the one side, and Cahusac, out of whose uneasiness it all arose, on the other. Behind them in the sun-scorched, dusty square, sparsely fringed by palms, whose fronds drooped listlessly in the quivering heat, surged a couple of 100 wild fellows belonging to both parties, their own excitement momentarily quelled, so that they might listen to what passed among their leaders. Cahusac appeared to be having it all his own way, and he raised his harsh, querulous voice so that all might hear his truculent denunciation. He spoke, Pitt tells us, a dreadful kind of English, which the shipmaster, however, makes little attempt to reproduce. His dress was as discordant as his speech. It was of a kind to advertise his trade, and ludicrously in contrast with the sober garb of Hagthorpe and the almost foppish daintiness of Jeremy Pitt. His soiled and blood-stained shirt of blue cotton was open in front, to cool his hairy breast, and the girdle about the waist of his leather breeches carried an arsenal of pistols and a knife, whilst a cutlass hung from a leather baldric loosely slung about his body. Above his countenance, broad and flat as a Mongolian's, a red scarf was swayed turban-wise, about his head. Is it that I have not warned you from the beginning that all was too easy? He demanded between plaintiveness and fury. I am no fool, my friends. I have eyes, me, and I see. I see an abandoned fort at the entrance of the lake, and nobody there to fire a gun at us when we came in. Then I suspect a trap. Who would not that had eyes and brain? Bah! We come on. What do we find? A city, abandoned like the fort. A city out of which the people had taken all things of value. Again I warn Captain Blood. It is a trap, I say. We are to come on, always to come on, without opposition, until we find that it is too late to go to sea again, that we cannot go back at all. But no one will listen to me. You all know so much more. Name of God, Captain Blood. He will go on, and we go on. We go to Gibraltar. True that at last, after a long time, we catch the deputy governor. True, we make him pay big ransom for Gibraltar. True, between that ransom and the loot we return here with some 2,000 pieces of 8. But what is it, in reality, will you tell me? Or shall I tell you, it is a piece of cheese and a mousetrap, and we are the little mice. God damn. And the cats. Oh, the cats, they wait for us. The cats are those 4 Spanish ships of war that have come meantime, and they wait for us outside the bottleneck of this lagoon. Mort de Dieu, that is what comes of the damned obstinacy of your fine Captain Blood. Wolverstone laughed. Cahusac exploded in fury. Ah, sang you, tourist animal? You laugh. Tell me this. How do we get out again unless we accept the terms of Monsieur the Admiral of Spain? From the buccaneers at the foot of the steps came an angry rumble of approval. The single eye of the gigantic Wolverstone rolled terribly, and he clenched his great fists as if to strike the Frenchman, who was exposing them to mutiny. But Cahusac was not daunted. The mood of the men enheartened him. You think, perhaps, this your Captain Blood is a good God, that he can make miracles. Eh? He is ridiculous, you know, this Captain Blood, with his grand air and his... He checked. Out of the church at that moment, grand air and all, sauntered Peter Blood. With him came a tough, long-legged Frenchy wolf named d'Iberville, who, though still young, had already won fame as a privateer commander before the loss of his own ship had driven him to take service under Blood. The captain advanced towards a disputing group, leaning lightly upon his long ebony cane, his face shaded by a broad-plumed hat. There was in his appearance nothing of the buccaneer. He had much more the air of a lounger in the Mall or the Alameda, the latter rather, since his elegant suit of violet taffetas with gold-embroidered buttonholes was in the Spanish fashion. But the long, stout, serviceable rapier, thrust up behind by the left hand resting lightly on the pommel, corrected the impression that, and those steely eyes of his announced the adventurer. You find me ridiculous, Cahusac, said he, as he came to a halt before the Breton, whose anger seemed already to have gone out of him. What, then, must I find you? He spoke quietly, almost wearily. You will be telling them that we have delayed, and that it is a delay that has brought about our danger. But whose is the fault of that delay? We have been a month in doing what should have been done, and what but for your blundering would have been done inside of a week. I say, nom de Dieu, was it my fault that... Was it anyone else's fault that you ran your ship La Foudre aground on the shoal in the middle of the lake? You would not be piloted. You knew your way. You took no soundings even. The result was that we lost 3 precious days in getting canoes to bring off your men and your gear. Those 3 days gave the folk at Gibraltar not only time to hear of our coming, but time in which to get away. After that, and because of it, we had to follow the governor to his infernal island fortress, and a fortnight and best part 100 lives were lost in reducing it. That's how we come to delayed until the Spanish fleet is fetched round from La Guerra by Guardacosta. And if you hadn't lost La Foudre, and so reduced our fleet from 3 ships to 2, we should even now be able to fight our way through with a reasonable hope of succeeding. Yet you think it is for you to come hectoring here, upbraiding us for a situation that is just the result of your own ineptitude. He spoke with a restraint which I trust you will agree was admirable when I tell you that the Spanish fleet guarding the bottleneck exit of the great lake of Maracaibo, and awaiting there the coming forth of Captain Blood with a calm confidence based upon its overwhelming strength, was commanded by his implacable enemy, Don Miguel de Espinosa y Valdez, the Admiral of Spain. In addition to his duty to his country, The admiral had, as you know, a further personal incentive arising out of that business aboard the Encarnacion a year ago, and the death of his brother Don Diego, and with him sailed his nephew Esteban, whose vindictive zeal exceeded the admiral's own. Yet, knowing all this, Captain Blood could preserve his calm in reproving the cowardly frenzy of one for whom the situation had not half the peril with which it was fraught for himself. He turned from Cahusac to address the mob of buccaneers, who had surged nearer to hear him, for he had not troubled to raise his voice. "I hope that will correct some of the misapprehension that appears to have been disturbing you," said he. "There's no good can come of talking of what's past and done," cried Cahusac, more sullen now than truculent. Whereupon Wolverstone laughed, a laugh that was like the neighing of a horse. "The question is, what are we to do now?" "Sure, now, there's no question at all," said Captain Blood. "Indeed, but there is," Cahusac insisted. "Don Miguel, the Spanish admiral, have offered us safe passage to sea if we will depart at once, do no damage to the town, release our prisoners, and surrender all that we took at Gibraltar." Captain Blood smiled quietly, knowing precisely how much Don Miguel's word was worth. It was Iberville who replied, in manifest scorn of a compatriot, which argues that, even at this disadvantage as he is us, the Spanish admiral is still afraid of us. "That can be only because he not know our real weakness," was the fierce retort. "And, anyway, we must accept these terms. We have no choice. That is my opinion." "Well, it's not mine now," said Captain Blood, "so I refuse them." "Refuse?" Cahusac's broad face grew purple. A muttering from a man behind enheartened him. "You have refused? You have refused already, and without consulting me? Your disagreement could have altered nothing. You'd have been outvoted, for Hagthorpe here was entirely in my own mind. Still," he went on, "if you and your own French followers wish to avail yourselves of the Spaniards' terms, we shall not hinder you. Send one of your prisoners to announce it to the admiral. Don Miguel will welcome your decision, you may be sure." Cahusac glowered at him in silence for a moment. Then, having controlled himself, he asked in a concentrated voice, "Precisely what answer have you made to the admiral?" A smile irradiated the face and eyes of Captain Blood. "I have answered him that unless within 24 hours we have his parole to stand out to sea, ceasing to dispute our passage or hinder our departure, and a ransom of 50,000 pieces of 8 for Maracaibo, we shall reduce this beautiful city to ashes, and thereafter go out and destroy his fleet." The impudence of it left Cahusac speechless. But among the English buccaneers in the square, there were many who savored the audacious humor of the trap dictating terms to the trappers. Laughter broke from them. It spread into a roar of acclamation, for bluff is a weapon dear to every adventurer. Presently, when they understood it, even Cahusac's French followers were carried off their feet by that wave of jocular enthusiasm, until in his truculent obstinacy Cahusac remained the only dissentient. He withdrew in mortification, nor was he to be mollified until the following day brought him his revenge. This came in the shape of a messenger from Don Miguel, with a letter in which the Spanish admiral solemnly vowed to God that, since the pirates had refused his magnanimous offer to permit them to surrender with the honors of war, he would now await them at the mouth of the lake there to destroy them on their coming forth. He added that should they delay their departure, he would so soon as he was reinforced by a 5th ship, the Santo Nino, on its way to join him from La Guerra, himself come inside to seek them at Maracaibo. This time Captain Blood was put out of temper. "Trouble me no more," he snapped at Cahusac, who came growling to him again. "Send word to Don Miguel that you have seceded from me. He'll give you safe conduct, devil a doubt. Then take one of the sloops, order your men aboard and put to sea, and the devil go with you." Cahusac would certainly have adopted that course if only his men had been unanimous in the matter. They, however, were torn between greed and apprehension. If they went, they must abandon their share of the plunder, which was considerable, as well as the slaves and other prisoners they had taken. If they did this, and Captain Blood should afterwards contrive to get away unscathed, and from their knowledge of his resourcefulness, the thing, however unlikely, need not be impossible. He must profit by that which they now relinquished. This was a contingency too bitter for contemplation. And so, in the end, Despite all that Cahusac could say, the surrender was not to Don Miguel, but to Peter Blood. They had come into the venture with him, they asserted, and they would go out of it with him or not at all. That was the message he received from them that same evening by the sullen mouth of Cahusac himself. He welcomed it, and invited the Breton to sit down and join the council, which was even then deliberating upon the means to be employed. This council occupied the spacious patio of the governor's house, which Captain Blood had appropriated to his own uses, a cloistered stone quadrangle in the middle of which a fountain played coolly under a trellis of vine. Orange trees grew on two sides of it, and the still, evening air was heavy with the scent of them. It was one of those pleasant exterior interiors which Moorish architects had introduced to Spain, and the Spaniards had carried with them to the New World. Here that council of war, composed of 6 men in all, deliberated until late that night upon the plan of action which Captain Blood put forward. The great freshwater lake of Maracaibo, nourished by a score of rivers from the snow-capped ranges that surround it on two sides, is some 120 miles in length and almost the same distance across at its widest. It is, as has been indicated, in the shape of a great bottle having its neck towards the sea at Maracaibo. Beyond this neck it widens again, and then the two long, narrow strips of land known as the islands of Vigilias and Palomas block the channel, standing lengthwise across it. The only passage out to sea for vessels of any draft lies in the narrow strait between these islands. Palomas, which is some 10 miles in length, is unapproachable for half a mile on either side by any but the shallowest craft save at its eastern end, where, completely commanding the narrow passage out to sea, stands a massive fort which the buccaneers have found deserted upon their coming. In the broader water between this passage and the bar, the 4 Spanish ships were anchored in mid-channel. The Admiral's Encarnacion, which we already know, was a mighty galleon of 48 great guns and 8 small. Next in importance was the Salvador with 36 guns. The other 2, the Infanta and the San Felipe, those smaller vessels, were still formidable enough with their 20 guns and 150 men apiece. Such was the fleet of which the Gauntlet was to be run by Captain Blood with his own Arabella of 40 guns, the Elizabeth of 26, and 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, which they had indifferently armed with 4 culverins each. In men, they had a bare 400 survivors of the 500-odd that had left Tortuga, to oppose the fully 1,000 Spaniards manning the galleons. The plan of action submitted by Captain Blood to that council was a desperate one, as Cahusac uncompromisingly pronounced it. "Why, so it is," said the captain, "but I've done things more desperate." Complacently he pulled at a pipe that was loaded with that fragrant sacerdotes tobacco for which Gibraltar was famous, and of which they had brought away some hogsheads. And what is more, they succeeded. Audices fortuna juvat. Bedad, they knew their world, the old Romans. He breathed into his companions, and even into Cahusac, some of his own spirit of confidence, and in confidence all went busily to work. For 3 days from sunrise to sunset, the buccaneers labored and sweated to complete the preparations for the action that was to procure them their deliverance. Time pressed. They must strike before Don Miguel de Espinosa received the reinforcement of that 5th galleon, the Santo Nino, which was coming to join him from La Guerra. Their principal operations were on the larger of the 2 sloops captured at Gibraltar, to which vessel was assigned a leading part in Captain Blood's scheme. They began by tearing down all bulkheads, until they reduced her to the merest shell, and in her sides they broke open so many ports that her gunwale was converted into the semblance of a grating. Next they increased by a half-dozen scuttles in her deck, whilst into her hull they packed all the tar and pitch and brimstone that they could find in the town, to which they added 6 barrels of gunpowder, placed on end like guns at the open ports on her larboard side. On the evening of the 4th day, everything being now in readiness, all were got aboard, and the empty, pleasant city of Maracaibo was at last abandoned, but they did not weigh anchor until some 2 hours after midnight. Then, at last, on the first of the ebb, they drifted silently down towards the bar with all canvas furled save only their spilt sails, which, so as to give them steering way, were spread to the faint breeze that stirred through the purple darkness of the tropical night. The order of their going was as follows. Ahead went the improvised fire ship in charge of Wolverstone, with a crew of 6 volunteers, each of whom was to have 100 pieces of 8 over and above his share of plunder as a special reward. Next came the Arabella. She was followed at a distance by the Elizabeth, commanded by Hagthorpe, with whom was the now shipless Cahusac and the bulk of his French followers. The rear was brought up by the second sloop and some 8 canoes, aboard of which had been shipped the prisoners, the slaves, and most of the captured merchandise. The prisoners were all pinioned and guarded by 4 buccaneers with musketoons who manned these boats in addition to the 2 fellows who were to sail them. Their place was to be in the rear, and they would take no part whatever in the coming fight. As the first glimmerings of opalescent dawn dissolved the darkness, the straining eyes of the buccaneers were able to make out the tall rigging of the Spanish vessels, riding at anchor less than a quarter of a mile ahead, entirely without suspicion as the Spaniards were, and rendered confident by their own overwhelming strength. It is unlikely that they use a vigilance keener than their careless habit. Certain it is that they did not sight Blood's fleet in that dim light until some time after Blood's fleet had sighted them. By the time that they had actively roused themselves, Wolverstone's sloop was almost upon them, speeding under canvas, which had been crowded to her yards the moment the galleons had loomed into view. Straight for the Admiral's great ship, the Encarnacion, did Wolverstone head the sloop. Then, lashing down the helm, he kindled from a match that hung ready lighted beside him a great torch of thickly plaited straw that had been steeped in bitumen. First it glowed. Then as he swung it round his head, it burst into flame, just as the slight vessel went crashing and bumping and scraping against the side of the flagship, whilst rigging became tangled with rigging, to the straining of yards and snapping of spars overhead. His 6 men stood at their posts on the larboard side, stark naked, each armed with grapnel, 4 of them on the gunwale, 2 of them aloft. At the moment of impact, these grapnels were slung to bind the Spaniard to them, those aloft being intended to complete and preserve the entanglement of the rigging. Aboard the rudely awakened galleon, all was confused, hurrying, scurrying, trumpeting, and shouting. At first there had been a desperately hurried attempt to get up the anchor, but this was abandoned as being already too late. And conceiving themselves on the point of being boarded, the Spaniards stood arms to ward off the onslaught. Its slowness in coming intrigued them, being so different from the usual tactics of the buccaneers. Further intrigued were they by the sight of the gigantic Wolverstone speeding naked along his deck with a great flaming torch held high. Not until he had completed his work did they begin to suspect the truth, that he was lighting slow matches, and then one of their officers, rendered reckless by panic, ordered a boarding party on to the shop. The order came too late. Wolverstone had seen his 6 fellows drop overboard after the grapnels were fixed, and then had sped himself to the starboard gunwale. Thence he flung his flaming torch down the nearest gaping scuttle into the hold, and thereupon dived overboard in his turn, to be picked up presently by the longboat from the Arabella. But before that happened, the sloop was a thing of fire, from which explosions were hurling blazing combustibles aboard the Encarnacion, and long tongues of flame were licking out to consume the galleon, beating back those daring Spaniards who, too late, strove desperately to cut her adrift. And whilst the most formidable vessel of the Spanish fleet was thus being put out of action at the outset, Blood had sailed and opened fire upon the Salvador. First athwart her hawse, he had loosed a broadside that had swept her decks with terrific effect. Then going on and about, he had put a second broadside into her hull at short range. Leaving her thus half-crippled, temporarily at least, and keeping his course, he had bewildered the crew of the Infanta by a couple of shots from the chasers on his beakhead, then crashed alongside to grapple and board her, whilst Hagthorpe was doing the like by the San Felipe. And in all this time not a single shot had the Spaniards contrived to fire, so completely had they been taken by surprise, and so swift and paralyzing had been Blood's stroke. Boarded now and faced by the cold steel of the buccaneers, neither the San Felipe nor the Infanta offered much resistance. The sight of their admiral in flames and the Salvador drifting crippled from the action had so utterly disheartened them that they accounted themselves vanquished and laid down their arms. If by a resolute stand the Salvador had encouraged the other 2 undamaged vessels to resistance, the Spaniards might well have retrieved the fortunes of the day. But it happened that the Salvador was handicapped in true Spanish fashion by being the treasure ship of the fleet, with plate on board to the value of some 50,000 pieces. Intent above all upon saving this from falling into the hands of the pirates, Don Miguel, who, with a remnant of his crew, had meanwhile transferred himself aboard her, headed her down towards Palomas and the fort that guarded the passage. This fort the admiral, in those days of waiting, had taken precautions secretly to garrison and rearm. For the purpose he had stripped the fort of Cajero, farther out on the Gulf, of its entire armament, which included some cannon royal of more than ordinary range and power. With no suspicion of this, Captain Blood gave chase, accompanied by the Infanta, which was manned now by a prize crew under command of Iberville. The stern chasers of the Salvador desultorily returned the punishing fire of the pursuers, but such was the damage she herself sustained that presently, coming under the guns of the fort, she began to sink and finally settled down in the shallows with part of her hull above water. Thence, some in boats and some by swimming, the admiral got his crew ashore on Palomas as best he could. And then, just as Captain Blood accounted the victory won, and that his way out of that trap to the open sea beyond lay clear, the fort suddenly revealed its formidable and utterly unsuspected strength. With a roar, the cannons royal proclaimed themselves, and the Arabella staggered under a blow that smashed her bulwarks at the waist and scattered death and confusion among the seamen gathered there. Had not Pitt, her master, himself seized a whipstaff and put the helm hard over to swing her sharply off to starboard, she must have suffered still worse from the second volley that followed fast upon first. Meanwhile, it had fared even worse with the Frailer Infanta. Although hit by one shot only, this had crushed her larboard timbers on the waterline, starting a leak that must presently have filled her, but for the prompt action of the experienced Iberville in ordering her larboard guns to be flung overboard. Thus lightened and listing now to starboard, he fetched her about and went staggering after the retreating Arabella, followed by the fire of the fort, which did them, however, little further damage. Out of range, at last, they lay to, joined by the Elizabeth and the San Felipe, to consider their position.